Most people are intimidated by poetry because they associate it with the classroom. They feel that in order to understand a poem, they have to understand it intellectually. But poetry is not primarily an intellectual art. Poetry is an art which communicates to the entire human being. It addresses us simultaneously as people who with intellects, emotions, imagination, intuition, memory, and physical bodies. The power of poetry is that it communicates in such a way that it doesn't ask us to separate our intellect from our emotions, our imagination from our physical body. It addresses us in the fullness of our humanity. That being said, however, we can analyze a poem if we want to. Now, if you look at the root of the word analysis, it comes from a Greek word which means to loosen, as in to loosen a knot that has been tied. So what I want to do in this talk is to take a single poem and show you how, if you want to, you can analyze it. Show you all of the levels to which a poem will respond to analysis. But in the end of the day, that kind of approach is not necessary to understand this poem or most poems. And in fact, the poem that we're going to talk about became one of the most popular poems in the English-speaking world by people who I think did not fully understand what was going on in it. The poem we're going to talk about is William Butler Yeats' classic, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, which was written in 1892. And I'm going to endeavor to analyze it, which is to say, to untie the elegant and tight knot that Mr. Yeats tied. First, let's just listen to it above an image of the place which it describes, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings, their midnights all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavements gray. I hear it in the deep heart's core. Now, we have a special resource with this poem because it is one of the very few poems that William Butler Yeats actually recorded. Yeats did not die until 1939, but although he had lived for half a century in the era of recorded sound, he almost never went before a microphone. So let's now put the text up on the screen and listen to William Butler Yeats recite his early masterpiece.
I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnights all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavements grey. I hear it in the deep heart's core.
That was the voice of William Butler Yeats. Now, I've spoken in earlier talks about how a poem announces its special status as a different kind of speech, its special status as art that requires a special kind of attention. A poem does this in many ways. Most important, it doesn't sound like speech or sound like prose. In oral cultures, from the moment that a speaker began reciting poetry, the listeners understood that they were hearing verse. They were hearing a specially crafted kind of language. We hear this in the very first sentence of Yeats's poem. Listen to the rhyme and meter that's already there in the first sentence. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. The first sentence is structured in such a way that we recognize it not as prose, but as metrical, rhymed verse. It announces its special status as art. Now let's put up on the screen a passage of William Butler Yeats's prose and this piece of verse. Can you recognize which half of the screen is verse? Of course you can. It seems like a silly question for me even to ask, but I ask it so that we can understand that our culture has certain visual conventions that it uses when it prints poetry to tell us that this is verse. You need to read it differently. Take a moment to look at all the white space on the page. The text is organized in verse into line units. There is also white space on the right hand of the margin after each line. These are visual signs to communicate two things. First, the text is verse, not prose. Second, the lines need to be read differently from prose. The visual shape reflects an auditory or musical shape inherent in the words. These typographic conventions are so familiar that we forget how peculiar they are and how important. Before we read the words, let's keep looking at the poem in visual terms. Let's just start with some obvious observations. It is a short poem. It's only 12 lines long, but the lines are rather long and wide on the page. As it turns out, they are sometimes as long as 15 syllables, but every 4 lines, the last line of each unit is shorter. The poem is written in 3 symmetrical stanzas, each of which has a shorter last line. The shape of the lines reflect the musical shape of the language. Now let's just look at the title and nothing else, because the title of a poem is often significant. A title can point out the central subject or mood of the poem. For example, the poet John Dryden wrote, "To the Memory of Mr. Oldham." This title tells us that the poem is about someone who has died, that the poem is an elegy for a departed friend. Dudley Randall wrote a poem called The Ballad of Birmingham. The title tells us 2 things, that the poem is a ballad, a song that tells a story, and that this story happens in Birmingham. As it turns out, it happens in Birmingham during the Civil Rights Movement when there is a church bombing. Secondly, the title can give us information that's not in the poem. Langston Hughes wrote a poem called Mother to Son. That lets us know who is speaking the poem and who is listening to the poem. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Ulysses lets us know that the speaker is the hero Ulysses, who is never named in the poem itself. Thirdly, the title can announce the form or genre of the poem. Elizabeth Bishop's poem Sistina announces that the poem, not surprisingly, is in the form of a sestina. Ezra Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter, is a letter written by the river merchant's wife to her absent husband. Now, what does Yeats's title tell us? What information does it contain? Well, in verbal terms, it contains three pieces of information. One, that there is an island. Two, that this island is actually in a lake, and that this is in a place called Innisfree, which, as it turns out, is a real place in Ireland. The title also provides the central image of the poem, but it's not the location of the poem, as it turns out. Now, Lake Isle of Innisfree. Which one of those words is different from the others? Which word is actually different from every other word in the text of the poem? It is the word Innisfree, which is not an English language word, but an Irish word. It means actually in Irish, Heather Island. So we have a title which describes a place that is in a foreign land, that is perceived in a foreign language. That little bit of information is very critical to the poem. So the title shows us right now not only the location of the poem, but something about the attitude of the poem. To analyze a poem is much more simple than people think. What you mostly have to do is to ask the obvious questions in a more or less systematic way. What type of poem is it? What is its mode? Is it a lyric? Is it a narrative? Is it a dramatic poem? What is the form? Does it have meter? Does it have rhyme? Is it in free verse? What is the diction or the vocabulary of the poem? Who is the speaker of the poem? Is there a storyline or action? What is the setting? What are the images? Are there figures of speech? Are there any allusions in the poem? What's the tone? And does the poem have any symbols? These are all fairly simple elements that you can look at in a rather straightforward way. Let's just start with the vocabulary or diction of the poem. Now, this poem, I think, was much simpler for readers in 1892 than it is today for a very straightforward reason. People 100 or 130 years ago were much more familiar with the countryside than are people today. So let's go through the words so we can make sure that we know exactly what they mean. Let's start with the title. What is a lake isle? I think it's pretty straightforward, but I've discovered some people don't actually know what it is. It's simply an island that's in the middle of a lake, which tends to mean that it's a relatively small island and, probably uninhabited or lightly inhabited. Secondly, what are wattles? The speaker is going to build a cabin of clay and wattles. Wattles are kind of weaving sticks and branches around poles. It's basically material that you can get from the land that this island is on. That's the same thing with the clay. The person building the cabin is building it with the cheapest, most accessible natural materials that are available. It's not going to be a lavish dwelling place. What is a bean row? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a row of beans that the speaker hopes to plant to have food. What is a glade? Many people don't know that. It's simply an open space in the woods. And what does the image "be loud" means? Where I live in Sonoma County, when I walk outside of my studio into just to be outside within the bushes, I can hear the bees buzzing happily in the rosemary that I've planted by there. So a bee loud glade is a place that's so quiet that you can actually hear the bees buzz as they gather pollen. What is a linnet? A linnet is just a songbird from the finch family, a very common bird in the British Isles. What is heather? Some people know that it's a plant, but they don't know what kind of a plant it is. It's a flowering shrub. It's usually about 2 feet tall, and the flower is usually purple. And why would the heather glow? Well, probably 2 reasons. First of all, when the sunlight catches the flowers, they're brighter. But secondly, perhaps because it's on an island, you not only see the heather, but you see the heather's reflection in the water around it. Those are just specific literal interpretations of the words. Because if you want to understand a poem, you have to understand the literal sense of a poem. If you see a word you don't understand, look it up. And so we have learned something before we've even analyzed the poem, not only about William Butler Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree, but about the natural world, about islands and plants and birds and forest formations that allow a glade to clear in the middle of them. So it's in a sense, it's put us into a kind of natural world. Now, if you take those words and say, which of them are images, let's just make a list of the images in the poem, and you'll be surprised that it almost takes you to the meaning of the poem. The Lake Isle of Innisfree is the first image. A small cabin, which is real or imaginary. 9 bean rows. A beehive. Honeybees. A bee-loud glade. That's an auditory, not a visual image. The veils of the morning. That's a metaphor for the morning mist. The crickets that are singing. The midnight all a glimmer. That's an interesting image because why is midnight all a glimmer? It's because you see both the stars in the sky and the stars on the water, or perhaps the moon in the sky and the moon in the water. The linnet's wings, once again, if you see finches, they're always flying and weaving in and out of the trees. The shore, which in this poem is not only a visual image, but also a kind of auditory image, because we're hearing the lapping of the waves against the shore. The lake water lapping is an auditory image. And then suddenly, the last 2 visual images of the poem are urban. The roadway and the pavement's gray. And then the final image is a kind of metaphoric one, the deep heart's core. So it's the heart of the heart, as it were. And so we see this wonderful sort of cascade of images going from the country on both night and day into an urban landscape. And you see the same thing in the colors. You have Innisfree, which is purple, it's glimmering, it's green, it's blue, and then you get to the city, and it's gray. Now, some of these images are also figures of speech, mostly metaphors and similes. Now, metaphors are important in a poem because that's the point where the writer is saying that the literal description is not quite enough, and they want to connect the literal description to some other kind of meaning. So what are the metaphors in this poem? The first is the veils of the morning, which I take to be a description of the morning mist. And a veil is something which covers something, usually a face, which then can be lifted to reveal it. And so it takes the morning mist and it adds an element of mystery to the beauty of that morning. And also the premonition of a revelation when the mist raises or the veil is raised. But the last line of the poem is a metaphor, the deep heart's core. Now, that's, very interesting because you've got not just the heart, which could be literal, but it's also, heart tends to be a metaphor for our emotions, our emotional center. But it's the deep part of the heart, and in the deep part of the heart is a core, which is the very heart of the heart, which is to say, the emotional center of one's emotions. Core itself is interesting because, it's not unlike the French word cœur, which means heart as well. So I think that Yeats is probably also hearing the French word behind the English word core. There's also these kinds of images. One's called a synecdoche, which is where a part of a thing is used to represent the whole. So the linnet's wings, because you can't see the whole bird a lot of times when a bird is flying. You just get a glimpse of the wings. Or a metonym, which is where a thing is presented by giving us something that's associated with it. We never see a city in this poem. We only see a roadway and the pavement's gray. Those images create or evoke the sense of a larger city, which is never described any further than that in the poem. So you have these very clever figures of speech where Yeats is able to suggest a whole broader range of meanings with a single word or two. Now let's look at the setting of the poem. Where does Lake Isle of Innisfree take place? Now, it's been my experience that 9 out of 10 people get this answer backwards because the poem describes the Lake Isle of Innisfree. The title of the poem is Lake Isle of Innisfree, but that's not the whole story because the poem takes place in 2 very distinct locations. The first is this Lake Isle in Ireland, which represents the natural world, but there's a second location, which is a modern city. And we know that because it has pavements and it has roadways. If the natural setting is full of color and beauty, the urban setting is gray and unpleasant. So where is the speaker when he speaks this poem? And this is the thing that most people don't realize. The speaker is not on the Lake Isle of Innisfree. The speaker is on the pavement's gray. And that is the key fact in terms of interpreting this poem. Now, if we back away from the text and we look at Yeats's life and we look at the year in which this poem is written, it is clear that the poem is written from, it is spoken from London. In the 1890s, London was the biggest city in the world. It had nearly 5 million people in it. And the city was filthy with coal exhaust, with poor sanitation, as millions of poor people were compressed into crowded buildings with inadequate services. The famous London fog was a dangerous kind of cloud of coal emissions that cloaked the city sometimes all day long where you couldn't even see the sun. This is the environment from which Yeats is speaking the poem. The poem is a wish fulfillment. And if we look at the speaker who is speaking the poem, what do we know about the person? We really don't know very much about the speaker except for his dreams and his aspirations. The actual facts about the speaker are almost minimal. We only know that the speaker is somehow living in a gray, modern city and that he longs to be in the country. He wants to return to Innisfree, to a place that he associates with peace, beauty, and authenticity. And where does he link with Innisfree? It's in sound, curiously enough. In the deep heart's core, he hears the lake waters lapping. So we've seen the images, we've seen the figures of speech, we've talked about the speaker of the poem. If you're analyzing a poem, I think it's very, very useful to see if you can condense it into a short plot. What is the plot? What is the story? What is the action of the poem? It's really quite simple. You have a speaker who seems as if he is trapped unhappily in a modern city, who wants to arise and go to the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And when the speaker goes there, he wants to construct a very simple life that's connected to nature and this specific place. He wants to live in a very humble dwelling that he's going to build with local materials. He wants to eat very simple food, most of which he seems to grow or gather himself. Now, the question is, has the speaker actually been to the Lake Isle of Innisfree before? We don't know for sure, but he describes the place so exactly, with so many specific details, that he must be remembering a place which is very important in his own life. Once again, if you think of Yeats, the Irishman, living in urban London, we understand a kind of autobiographical impulse that's being illustrated in this poem. But Yeats keeps himself almost entirely outside of the poem. There's virtually no autobiographical details whatsoever. It could conceivably be spoken by a woman, a man, a young person, an older person. Those things are deliberately left out of the poem. But before we sort of finish up our analysis, I want to point out that there's also an allusion in the poem. This is an allusion that absolutely every reader in 1892 would have recognized, but nowadays most people miss. This allusion is so important that Yeats gives it not once, but twice in the poem. It actually is the first line. I will arise and go now. And then again in line 9, the speaker repeats, I will arise and go now. Where does this quotation come from? It comes from the parable of the Prodigal Son, which is in the Gospel according to Luke. Now, this is a very famous parable. It may be the most famous parable in the New Testament. It's the story of a father who has 2 sons. The younger son comes to him and says, I'm unhappy here. I want my inheritance. So the father gives the younger son his inheritance, and the son goes off into a foreign land where he spends all of his money in riotous living. He is reduced to poverty, and the only job that he can get is tending to the pigs. Now you have to think of this. This is a Jewish story. So pigs are unclean animals. I mean, it's an absolutely degrading occupation for this poor young man. A famine comes to the land. He's starving. Even the pigs eat better than him. He recognizes the terrible mistake of his life, and he says, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. Now, if you know the parable, the father does not rebuke the son. He welcomes him. He gives him a robe. He gives him a ring for his finger, and they kill the fatted calf, the famous fatted calf, so they can throw a feast. So Yeats is taking this very famous moment from the New Testament, because when does the prodigal son say these words? When he is poor, filthy, and starving, when he is living among people unhappily in a foreign land. After having wasted his inheritance, he decides to reform his life by rising and going back to his native land, his native people. When the speaker of Yeats's poem quotes these lines at the start of the poem, what does he imply? The speaker implies that his present life is not right. He needs to return to his origins, which are beautiful and authentic and nourishing in the way that this bleak gray city is not. You can't fully understand the poem without understanding that allusion. That allusion brings you really into the deep heart's core of the poem. So if you think about that, you understand why this poem was suddenly so popular, not simply in Ireland and England, but all across the English-speaking world. This was the poem that made Yeats a famous poet. And in fact, when he records it, he says, well, if you know anything about me, you will know this poem. Because Yeats, who you remember keeps himself almost invisible in this poem, speaks for a whole class of people, for millions of people who have left their families, their countries, the natural world, to come to these big teeming cities to make a living. And he has articulated their aspirations, their pain, their nostalgia, their emotions.